Hey, what's up, guys? Hope you're having a great Labor Day holiday, enjoying your day off with friends and family. Myself, I'm slightly hungover because yesterday was my wife's birthday and we went out and had a few drinks. You know how we do. But anyway, normally on Mondays, of course, I do the Neutral Corner boxing podcast on the Ring Digital YouTube channel. We're not going to do TNC today. I wanted to do a different kind of video and present some information that I hope you guys find interesting. Of course, every year at Ring Magazine, we do our year-end awards, and one of them is the Fight of the Year. And I want to talk about the Fight of the Year going back decades in this video and kind of use the Fight of the Year, which of course is only a piece of the pie, of the whole boxing pie. But I wanted to use the Fight of the Year as an example just to show you guys how much the boxing landscape has changed over the decades. It's something I talk about on my show all the time. The way the floodgates have opened and boxing has become so international, really in the 2000s, but it's a process that started maybe in the 80s and 90s. So we're going to go back and look at each decade, going back about 50 years or so, and I'll present some graphics just to show you guys where these fights of the year were taking place and the fighters that were participating in them, what part of the world they are from, and how the look and the feel of boxing has changed over the years. So I think you're going to find this interesting. One reason why I decided to do this, I was actually watching the first fight between Riddick Bowe and Andrew Golota. And of course, both of their fights ended with Andrew Golota losing his mind and beating the hell out of Riddick Bowe's nuts. Those are two fights he probably could have won before he lost his shit. But anyway, that first fight was in New York, inside Madison Square Garden. And during the promotion for that fight and the commentary, of course, they talk about the Garden and they refer to it as the Mecca of boxing. And this is something I've talked about a lot in recent years, that New York isn't the Mecca of boxing anymore, and it hasn't been for a long, long time. And the Garden shouldn't be called the Mecca of boxing, in my opinion, because it hasn't been for decades. And in the United States, all the juice is out on the West Coast right now. And it's something that I've talked about for years. And I get flack sometimes for it, but it's the truth. And I think when I show some of these graphics, you guys will see what I'm talking about. So anyway, when I watched that fight, I was thinking to myself, when was the last fight of the year in the Garden? And I was thinking back to the 90s, 80s. You got to go back to the 70s. You got to go back almost 50 years. Can you guys guess which fight? Some of you will know right away. Boom, it'll pop right in your head. But for some of you guys, it might take a minute. Think about it, almost 50 years before we had the last fight of the year in the Garden. So let's look at the 1970s right now. I'm going to pull up a graphic and I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. Okay, so over to the left, you see all of the fights of the year as awarded by Ring Magazine in the 1970s. You see the fighters and you see a flag, and that shows, of course, where the fighters are from. And then over to the right, just some information that I put in. So there were 10 fights of the year, obviously, in that decade. And of course, 2 fighters each fight. That means there were 20 participants in these 10 fights of the year. If you look at fight locations, 4 of them were in the United States. 2 of them in Las Vegas, 1 in New York in the Garden. That's the fight I was just talking about. That was in 1971 between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, of course. And 1 was in Texas. And then you see other countries represented. 1 in Italy, Jamaica, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, the UK, and Zaire. If you look at the fighters, you see American dominance. 17 of the 20 participants in these fights of the year were from the USA. 1 from Argentina, 1 from Italy, 1 from the UK. You also see heavyweight dominance. Look at the names: Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, of course, George Foreman, Jimmy Young, Spinks, all these heavyweights on there. So American dominance and heavyweight dominance. And what I find most interesting about the 70s is that although most of the fighters in these fights of the year were American, the fights were taking place for the most part overseas. So the 1970s, a decade of American dominance, a decade of American heavyweight dominance. Let's look at the 1980s and see how fast things began to change. Now, the first thing you'll notice here in the 80s, 0 heavyweights. 0 heavyweights. We go from a decade of dominance to no heavyweights being involved in the fight of the year. Another thing you'll note, the first time you see Mexicans represented in the fight of the year. Can you guys believe this? Before the 1980s, there were zero Mexican fighters involved in the fight of the year. That's really, really hard to believe now, right? Most of you younger fans can't imagine that. But it wasn't until the 1980s when you saw Mexicans show up on this list. Also, another big difference, 9 of the 10 fights of the year took place in the United States. Half of the 10 took place in Las Vegas. You had a couple in California and a couple in New Jersey. So that was a big change. Although the talent pool was becoming a little more diverse, you see Americans still dominate. 13 of the 20 participants were from America, 3 from Mexico. 1 from Panama, 1 from Puerto Rico, 1 from Uganda, 1 from the UK. So things were opening up a little bit and becoming a little more international, but the fights were all happening, for the most part, in the USA, specifically in Las Vegas. Again, it's hard to imagine no Mexicans in the fight of the year before the 1980s. That just sounds crazy now thinking about it. But you're going to see this trend where more and more fighters from different parts of the world get involved on this list. Let's jump to the 1990s. So in the 90s, you do see some heavyweight representation there. So after the drought in the 80s, you had this great heavyweight era in the 90s. You see some all-time greats on that list right there. Also, again, you see 9 of the 10 fights of the year happening in America, and once again, 5 of them in Las Vegas, 1 in Mexico. There's less Americans on the list, but they still make up over half of the 20 participants, right? So you got 11 Americans, 4 Mexicans, 2 Canadians, Argentina, Nigeria, and Thailand. So the fighters becoming more diverse, but America still has over half of the representation in the fights of the year in the 1990s. But you see things starting to change, and you see Mexicans becoming more and more prominent on the list. So now we jump to the 2000s, and this is where things really change. One quick stat I'll share with you guys. Of course, we've had 20 years in the 2000s so far. So 20 years, 20 fights of the year, 40 fighters involved. 16 of them have been from Mexico. Almost half of the fighters involved in the fights of the year in the 2000s have been from Mexico. You see the demographics really begin to change here. Let's jump into the 2000s. Look at the names on this list. You see a lot of repeats. Morales, Barrera, Marquez, Vasquez, Mickey Ward, Arturo Gatti. Over and over you see these names. Again, 9 of the 10 fights happening in the United States, but you see it's kind of all over America now. 3 in Vegas, 2 in Texas, 1 in Cali, and several on the East Coast, 1 in France. But for the first time, look at this, 10 of the fighters from Mexico, less than half from the United States. This is the first time that this has happened ever. The 2000s was the first decade where the fights of the year, less than half of the fighters were from the United States. And it's never gone back. But half of them from Mexico, that's a big deal. The Mexicans definitely having a period of dominance here during this time. And this is kind of where they really took over and became the power structure, if you will, in North American boxing. Think about the WBC, of course, headquartered in Mexico, and a lot of the great Mexican fighters had rivalries. Think back to like HBO Boxing After Dark and all the great pay-per-views and the rivalries between the featherweights in that era. It really was a special time, and this is where Mexicans really planted their flag as a dominant force in boxing. So again, in the 2000s, the United States representation in these fights of the year, less than half. That's the first time that it's ever happened. Again, go back to the link that I'll share with you guys. Go all the way back to the 20s. And I should mention, if you go back, I think, to the 1950s, 19 of the 20 fighters were from the United States, and over half of the fights of the year in the 1950s took place, I believe, in New York State. But now you think, since 1971, we haven't had a fight of the year in New York State, not just MSG, but New York State. Things have really changed, not just globally, but here in the United States. The power structure moved over to the West Coast, to Los Angeles, which has the best gym scene on earth. Fighters from all over the world moved to Southern California, the LA area, to train there. And then, of course, Vegas is the place where all the big fights take place. So from the East Coast to the West Coast in the United States, and from the United States to global, all over the world. The sport has changed so much. But check out the 2010s. So in the 2000s, one thing I forgot to mention, no heavyweights, right? In the 2010s, we finally got some heavyweight representation again with that great fight between Joshua and Klitschko. But let's look at the location first, okay? So you had 7 fights in the United States, 7 of the 10 fights, 4 of them in Los Angeles, in California, 2 of them in Vegas, only 1 on the East Coast. And that's what I'm talking about here. It is very, very clear that the West Coast has become the hot spot and truly the new Mecca of boxing in the United States. It's not New York. And this isn't an East Coast versus West Coast, debate or anything. It's just, it is what it is. California and Vegas, 6 of the 10 fights of the year in the 2010s. And then Japan, Puerto Rico, and the UK. Look at where the fighters are from. 10 different countries. Mexico is 6. The USA with only 4. And look, for the first time, you see representation from Japan, the Philippines, right? You're seeing more Asian representation. For the first time, you see Eastern European representation. Kazakhstan, Russia, the Ukraine. So you're starting to see the demographics really open up, and Asian fighters being featured more, Eastern European fighters being featured more. It shows you just how global this sport has become. And Americans once dominated this list. Just go back to the 1970s, about 50 years ago, and you see a lot of American flags. Now you look at this graphic and you see flags from 10 different countries. Okay, guys, so that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, just let me know. If you have any ideas for, a subject you'd like me to dive into, and just, provide some numbers. Sometimes, boxing isn't really a numbers sport like baseball and other sports, but I like to bring up numbers in boxing because I think, I don't know if people do that. And sometimes numbers and graphics and things like that really, really do give you an indication. Again, they're only a piece of the pie, but they give you an overall indication of what's going on. And in boxing, it's very interesting to see how just from the 1970s through the 2010s, you're talking 40, 50 years, how global this sport has become, and also how the demographics and everything have changed, and also where the fights are taking place. That's changed a lot as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Of course, the way you can help me out is liking, sharing, subscribing. Drop a comment below, let me know what you think, and please share this thing, man. Get it out there and let people know, all right? Have a happy, safe, fun Labor Day, and I'll see you at the fights.